Hey all, this is Mika here, back with another video. This one's going to be a war tier list for the new patch. This is based off of about 5 recent wars, 2 to 3 I would consider to be tier 1, a tier 1.5, and then the rest are mostly tier 3-ish level, and that's all based off of NA East and NA West. And then the other announcement I have is we're really close to 1k subs, and I figured this would be a good video to get over that mark potentially, because this is what this channel was originally took off for, is these tier lists. So popping right into it, the tier list, I'm going to start with must-haves, then go to meta-defining builds, generally good builds, situational builds, and then not advised builds. They are what they say they are. The must-have ones, if you don't have in your army, you're actively kind of trolling. The meta-defining ones, you should be trying to fit as many of these builds in your army as you possibly can. And then the generally good ones are good supplemental builds, situational builds kind of depend on your roster and your strategy, and then not advised builds are builds that generally, in pretty much in every single case, don't make sense to run in your army as a whole. Starting off with the weapon tier list, Life Staff is a must-have weapon. You can't play a war without a Life Staff, it kind of goes without saying. Ice Gauntlet I'd also consider to be a must-have because it's so good on so many classes. It's situationally good on Life Staff, it's really good with Void Gauntlet. People have explored running it on things like Spear, which is different. People run it with BB. It's just a really good weapon, and the other thing at Ice Gauntlet that makes it so powerful right now is it gets around the Elemental version meta, which everyone's warding the Elemental version, but the Storm doesn't count as Elemental version. It doesn't proc versus that, and Ice Spike doesn't proc versus that. So it allows classes like Fire Staff to get around their counter matchup if people heavily ward to Fire and just one-shot healers with Ice Spike instead, which inherently just makes Ice Gauntlet very, very strong. The other weapon I'd say is a must-have is Rapier. It's situationally good with Fire Staff, it's really good with Life Staff, it's really good with basically any Dex class. It's good with Spear, it's uh good with Bow, decent with Musket, but Musket as a whole is not very powerful right now. It's kind of hard to go wrong with a Rapier or Ice Gauntlet as a secondary weapon, and those two are the best secondary weapons. Hatchet used to be up here as sort of like a must-have thing for the time between the PTR was released and it actually came out, but it fell off significantly with the nerf, and I would consider it to not really be viable anymore as a PvP weapon in general. It has good movement, but the actual survivability aspect is so nerfed that it makes more sense just to run a Rapier for the same thing. So hopping into meta defining, Fire Staff is very, very strong. It is overtuned. I think a lot of people have been on defense of, hey, is Fire Staff better? Is Bow better? It's been a little bit hard to tell, but from overall, I'd say Fire Staff is a bit better. The main reason why Fire Staff I consider to be better is if you run it with an Ice Gauntlet and you're good with Spike, you can get around your counter matchup, which Bow inherently can't do with the Thrust. Like, Bows can slot int gems and try to get around it that way, but then you're cutting into elemental aversion territory, which is generally bad. Which that overall I think makes Fire Staff a little bit better. It also has the potential to nuke clumps and kill individual targets with the same set of skills, unlike Bow, which generally has to respec in order to have a more clump killing build and more of a single target killing build, which I think makes Fire Staff a little bit better overall. But that being said, the next best weapon I'd say on here is Bow. Bow is really good because everyone's slotting on elemental aversion, warding the Fire Staff. It just gets around it and hits like a truck. It's really hard to not die to a Bow if you are on a Bow, and bows have really good survivability as well. It seems just like a very good class overall. And the next one I'd say is Great Axe. Great Axe is just, you kind of need to have it. It's good in light right now, it's good in medium. I'd say it's a little bit worse than it used to be. It's no longer the we will blow everything up kind of class, but if you don't have Great Axe players, and people won't be as grouped, it'll be a little bit harder to kill people because how the grab forces out stam basically from people dodging in it. And overall, it's just something that you kind of need to have. That being said, I don't think it's always a situation now where in a ball build you need to have 2 Great Axe. I think there's an argument to say slot 1 Great Axe, slot maybe a Void Blade or a Spear, some sort of util based build, and then try to sneak in some more Kill Squad builds, because Kill Squads tend to be more powerful in this current patch than the actual ball builds themselves. That being said, ball builds are very necessary in terms of Great Axe Warhammer, especially when it comes to gate phase, but you can kind of get an advantage if you have more Kill Squad builds, because you can force the ball builds to play further back. It makes it easier to get into that gate, and once you get into that gate, that's honestly the hardest part of war being done. The hardest part of war right now seems to be actually getting into the gate itself, especially with how many fire staffs are stacked up top of gates that could very easily just 3-2-1 your healers. It feels a lot easier than it was with musket because they have access to AoEs and not single targets. Feels a lot harder to dodge and honestly a little bit more oppressive. So trying to figure out a way to get into the fort has been the struggle of many companies on the most recent patch. The next thing I have on this list are generally good builds. Sword and Shield is a generally good build. It is very good as a kill squad build right now, especially with the Great Axe, or the Great Sword nerfs and the Great Axe nerfs. It seems to be the thing that people have gone to. The main advantage of Sword and Shield is you can have 6 like damage-oriented perks, which just transforms it to be like a very, very nuker build. The main problem with it is you have to lower your armor class to do so, meaning that you will take more damage than other classes generally. But the upside is very, very big. The leadership bonus is very big as well. It is very scary and lives better than a great sword at the moment, so I'd say it's just generally a good build for that. It's also meta defining from a point tank perspective because this is the only class in the game that has access to AoE Old Fortify, and that AoE Old Fortify seems super, super necessary in order to survive dives. And the range on that Fortify is a little bit bigger than the visual shows. It's a whole meter bigger, so but it's very important to have these SNS builds in your army as a whole, and they are just generally good to have. If you have a doubt, then SNS is good. It also seems viable with Great Axe, weirdly. Not something that I would have thought of right away, but kind of came from testing, and it does not seem bad in that role whatsoever. Void Gauntlet's also a generally good build. This went from must-have to generally good like almost overnight due to people discovering what the Stalwart Firestorm ult does, which I'll get to in a minute. But Void Gauntlet has access to Old Ren, which makes it very, very strong. The Scream feels a lot weaker than it did before. Oblivion feels a lot weaker than it did before. But just because it has Old Ren, it just makes it a generally good build. I could very easily see Void Gauntlet in the future being outclassed by Blunderbuss in terms of being a support build if the actual old Ren gets changed to be new Ren. If that happened alone, I think Blunderbuss would be a stronger support build. That being said, next build I have on here is Blunderbuss. It does more damage than it did before. It has a lot less survivability than it did before. You have to stack aversion with this in order for it to work well, but it's still like a generally good build. I wouldn't say it's a very good like kind of tank build, but it's like a build that you can play to peel off people in your backline to a degree, as long as you're not the first one at the fire staff sees, because you will just lose that duel off a range alone. But it is very good at nuking clumps, and it's also a good support to fire staff as a whole. In terms of situational kind of weapons, Warhammer situational, it's really only viable with Great Axe at the moment in terms of war meta. In OPR, I don't think it's bad with SNS, but in terms of wars, it's just only really viable with Great Axe Warhammer. Spear seems to be a generally situational weapon. It's very good, but it's just kind of hard to find a slot for a lot of these in an army because the other builds are just so much better sounding on this list. The weakens that it have seem to be good, but SNS seems to outclass it in terms of weakens because the SNS has access to a 20% AoE weaken versus Spear single target weakens. It still seems like a decent weapon overall, and it's not a bad weapon to go. It's very good for disruptors, and that's the main role where it is slotted at the moment. Great Sword's also generally a situational weapon. It's being used now as a secondary weapon rather than the primary, just to get stand back quicker. Seems decent with SNS, seems decent with most kill squad builds. Seems like not a bad weapon in terms of the secondary, but other than being as a secondary, it's not really as useful as it was before. It still has the potential to one-shot people, and it can very easily one-shot people if you're unchecked. But at the same time, if you go into Onslaught, you literally cut your HP down by a third of what it is normally, like if you actually look at the effective HP. So it's just a very easy way to find an early grave if you run that build. Hatchet is also not really advised, and Musket is not really advised due to heavy nerfs and not a lot of compensation for those nerfs. In terms of ults and which ones are the best, Stalwart Firestorm, as I alluded to earlier, is I think the best ult in the game at the moment. What this ult allows you to do is it allows you to apply a weaken to the other team, empower your team, and strip all dots and reduce burn damage. The part that is kind of weird is like you would say like why is stripping dots good? Like that there's other things that you could be running. You could be running haste, but that haste is going to stack towards invig. Generally isn't good unless you're off a point. But what the stripping dots does, the Void Gauntlet's Old Rend actually counts as a dot because of Disintegrate and how it works, it is a dot and it applies Old Rend, so this will strip that Void Gauntlet Old Rend off of you, as well as the burns from Smolder, which will make Fire Staff do more damage. So effectively, this is an ult that just hard counters what is meta right now, and should be being run generally by Void Gauntlet players, should be run by point tank players. It's just a hard ult not to like once you get it. That being said, it's a very expensive ult to get right now. When I got this ult uh on Marama, it cost me about 30k gold to get one ult just because of how expensive flame cores are, and I expect that to go up once this video goes out. So you might need to find a way to farm those flame cores. There's other guys that I've seen for those, but they generally have a 5% drop rate from killing human mobs, so you just need to find a source for those. But once you have those, the ult itself is not that bad. The only other thing I'll warn you about is you need to have the adventure things from the faction vendor or from Brimstone Quest is another good source of them. So those are a little hard to get, and it could take you 5 days to get this ult. But once you get this ult, you'll notice it immediately how nice it can have you turn fights. If there's a 50-50 and your team has this and their team does not, you will just win that 50-50 every time. It seems generally better than Bile was, and I thought Bile was pretty good at turning that fight, but this seems very, very strong. Cutting Detonate is the other meta-defining ult. I'd say this is super strong because of the Ren changes, because there's not a lot of damage decrease to you anymore, and you don't like get blown up by using it. The other problem with it, though, is everyone's running Elemental Version, and then that will reduce the damage of the Detonate itself, so I find it hitting a lot less hard, but it doesn't damage you as much to kind of go for it. So it seems like a very good ult just slot in general for an army, and if you have like 5 to 10 of these going off at once, you very easily can clear a choke, but it's not always the best ult to run, but it's pretty good. In terms of meta-defining ults, I'd say Cunning Cannon's pretty good. This is a single target cannon. Not a lot of people are running the ward specific to this cannon, and it can hit for 4k, which tends to be a little bit harder than the detonate, but is single target and is ranged. It seems very good with a lot of kill squad builds like Fire Staff and Bow, where you just cancel attack into this cannon, and then from there you kind of clean them up with your other attacks. Stalwart Stormform also seems pretty good just for the getting the Fortify on you is not as good, but the heal is still good, and the grit is very, very strong for things like healers, and CC immunity is very strong as well. Seems like a pretty good ult to run for healers in general, and some kill squad players, if they're playing more aggro, tend to run this build or ult as well. Leeching Vines tends to be the most popular kind of vines now, just because of the Ren changes and the Fortify nerfs. It's not super good, but it's not bad. People also have access to passive freedom now, which just makes vines like it's generally not the best ult, but it's still a pretty good ult and can turn fights. Leeching Bio, I'd say, is also generally good. This is just because you damage that and you gain your life back. It seems to be, I think it's a little bit better than the Cunning Bio at this point, but both of them are kind of meh compared to some of the other ults on this list, but they're not bad. Cunning Bile, I think, is a situational ult, unlike a generally good ones I just mentioned. It's not bad. It's just not. It doesn't kill people as well as some of the other ults, and it seems like Stalwart Firestorm almost outclasses it, and Firestorms in general almost outclass it in terms of how clumps are being killed. It does have a really big range, which is nice, but that's like the main benefit of it. You can also dump it on people who you see are exhausted and now they're running away, and you can very easily secure kills with that, and that's the main util I see from that ult in general. Cunning Firestorm, I think, is generally weak. It hits for about 2k. People are heavily warding to fire. It doesn't make a lot of sense to run this ult right now, but if the fire meta kind of gets reduced, it could be viable in the future. Cunning Vines with Ren changes generally isn't very good. Brutal Firestorm, oh, sorry, I said the Cunning one wrong. Cunning is the one that gives haste. That one's not bad for Kill Squad, but for everything else, I think it's generally bad. Just because it will count as invig, and if you're on point, you're going to be slowed anyway, so you're not really going to feel the haste. Brutal Firestorm doesn't really make sense because people are warding to fire, and I would generally not advise to run that ult. And the Senate in general is still not viable and is very heavily needing buffs to be viable. In terms of the ball build tier list, Great Axe Warhammer seems to be meta-defining in terms of what you need. IGVG is also meta-defining in terms of like what was the old one. The Tria and IGVG I think changes a decent amount because of the CDR changes, but it's still kind of a needed build. You need one Great Axe Warhammer and one IGVG in every single ball group, but you don't need to have necessarily two of them. anymore, which is kind of nice, but you still need to have them, which is why they are must-have builds. Meta-defining builds, light Lifestaff Rapier. I guess this could be in a must-have as well, but you need the one with Sacred. It's just very solid in the ball group, and there's no reason not to run it. People tend to run it with a Beacon as well, which makes it solid. Orb is not as viable anymore as it once was. I would generally advise not running Orb for most builds, just because of how the Fortify changes work. Great Axe SNS, I think, is also a decently viable build. I think it's a decent supplement to Great Axe Warhammer. I think it's also, it's not something that would replace it, but it'd be like one of those other slots that you could fill with. BBIG, I think, is also something you can fill with. The disease is nice. The burst damage is the main thing that's nice, but the main problem with it is it's fire damage, and everyone's warding to fire damage right now. That being said, you still have the IG. You can still do some damage with that as well. But if you catch someone who doesn't have fire damage, this build could very easily just 2 or 3 top people now with the changes which buffed its actual damage. It didn't reduce its damage by much overall. Even with those Sloth Blast changes, it seems to hit very, very hard. BBVG, I think, is a situational build that's kind of come about. It's mostly just range, throwing disease and general damage at the comp. You have access to Old Rent, a decent burst, disease cap. It's, on theory, it sounds good. Reality is like kind of hard to live, but if you can live and throw that util at clumps, it can swing fights at times. So it seems situational to me. And then Heavy Void Blade, I think, is generally something I would tend not to run in a ball group. The main thing it lacks is just the actual tracking itself is kind of lackluster, and the closing distance part of Void Blade is the part where it struggles the most. The grit changes, while good, it tends to not be a lot of grit for the actual attack animation itself, unless you're running unless you're doing heavy attacks. So it doesn't feel super consistent, and I would generally not run it in a ball build. It seems a little bit better on a point setup though. In terms of Kill Squad, Light Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet is by far the best Kill Squad build. Nothing even comes close. It can counter its own counter by running Ice Gauntlet and going for Ice Spikes. Bow Rapier is also up there in terms of things that are must-haves. It seems very, very good with the Hatchet nerfs. It makes no sense to really prioritize that over Bow Rapier anymore. The Rapier nerfs are significant, but it still seems good enough to run the Bow Rapier over something else in terms of secondaries. Light Lifestaff Rapier with Clap, I'd say, is generally a meta-defining build for Kill Squad. It just allows you to not have to put yourself in as deep of spots and still pocket your Kill Squad due to the insane range of Clap. People usually run this with single targets, and I'd warn against running Fortified Sacred Ground on this build. It's not necessarily a damage nerf, it just doesn't do anything, and any other perk would be better than running Fortified Sacred Ground for a light group in particular. That being said, if you are going to run Sacred Ground and you have a Disruptor that's a medium, that can be situationally good to have the Sacred Ground for that specific Disruptor to stand in. But for every other light build, it will not really do anything for you. Fire Staff Blunderbuss, I think, is really good. The main problem with it is everyone's warding the fire, and you can't really get around that, which makes it a little bit worse in my eyes than Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet. If you have a equally skilled Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet and Fire Staff Blunderbuss, you take the Ice Gauntlet every day in this meta, but Blunderbuss is still a very good secondary for Fire Staff. Medium Life Staff Rapier with Clap, I think for Kill Squad in particular, is kind of okay. Life Staffs tend to get 3-2-1 and get blown up very easily right now. You don't lose a ton by running medium. You'll still be able to keep people up with your single target heals, because single target heals are just a very large amount, but you will increase your survivability at the same time. That being said, I still think it's a little bit worse than light. If you're good at positioning with light, it's generally better, but I don't think it's a bad idea to run medium ones if you just want you to make sure that your Kill Squad healer doesn't die, so your Kill Squad stays alive. Even if the heals are a little bit less, as long as they stay alive, that's generally what you want from that sort of slot. So I think it's okay to run those. In terms of other generally good builds, SNS Spear is generally pretty good. It's a good disruptor-oriented role. It can also provide decent damage. The leadership bonus is also nice. Not a lot to hate about that build with the recent changes. Like SNS Great Axe seems to be pretty solid as well. The grabs will reduce people's stamina, and you can kind of close the distance with SNS. You have a lot of escape tools with it. You have charge and you have leaving strikes to get out or in, so you have a lot of mobility. Allows you to kind of cross map dive people and really get in people's faces as well. And then you also can just block damage and kind of freeze fire staffs in their tracks if they are looking at you, and you can let your abilities come off cooldown and then use those to escape in those moments instead of having to spam dodge like other classes. Medium Spear Ice Gauntlet is also a pretty good disruptor-oriented build. It will stay alive very, very well with the lower stam dodges. It's really good in general. You need a healer with it, I'd say. Ice Gauntlet doesn't feel as tanky as it once was, but it's still a really good build to run in the other team's backline. Medium BBIG seems to be pretty good in terms of peeling your own backline. It's not as good as stabbing the other team's backline. I'd say light BBIG is a little bit worse than this, but medium, you compensate for the changes. You have a little bit more Fortify. Your Fortify is worth more when you're in medium too, so it makes you a lot tankier, and you still have really good damage with the changes. Light Lifestaff Rapier was Sacred. I talked about this a little bit earlier. I don't think it's generally super good. I would say it's a situational build to run, particularly if you have disruptors in your group. It can be situationally good. The Fortified Sacred Ground perk is kind of an interesting conversation. I think it's generally not worth running that anymore, but it's not bad if you do. If you have a medium disruptor, if you have light people only in your kill squad, that perk will basically do nothing for you, and it's the same as having 2 perk gear at this point. Light BBIG tends to be pretty solid, but the main thing it lacks is survivability. I think a light BBIG can basically get 3-tapped by a Fire Staff now, and the Fire Staff has bigger range, so you're in a really awkward spot where you have to like close the distance, but you don't want to get blown up at the same time. So you're going to be low stam taking the duel with Fire Staff by the time you close the distance, and the Fire Staff can very easily dodge you because you have to be super predictable at that point to get your combo off and get out. It just makes light BBIG a lot worse. That being said, if you're on something like defense, people will come into your gate and run next to you. You can very easily build them up at this build, but it's just kind of situational where it's good and where it's bad now because it's a lot worse at pressuring people, which just inherently makes BBIG with medium just a little bit better because that's where BBIG and medium excelled anyway because it was good at holding space. And this build kind of has to be a kind of a secondary fragger, if you will. People walk into your space and then you clear them out. You can't really take space with this build as well as you once were able to due to the meta shift. Light Firestaff Rapier is also kind of a situational build if you want to like really take the edge on a fight and you want to go like really, really aggro in there, but being able to live as well. This is a good build to complement that style. The Rapier will just allow you to get out. It'll also allow you to drop your con a little bit if you want to. So you can really nuke people with this setup, but it seems situational in general. Just make sure you're not reposting ranged attacks or you'll just find yourself being dead. Medium Spear Greatsword's also a decent disruptive build. You have to run Greatsword as a secondary. I'd say it's pretty situational, though, when you actually want to run this over IG. IG just tends to live, I think, a little bit better, but the nice part about this is you have access to basically unlimited stamina. It feels like you kind of need a pocket healer to run this build, though, and Spear IG can kind of exist a little bit better on its own. That being said, I think both are very strong, but this one's more situational than the other disruptor builds are. Light Spear Rapier is also kind of a situational build. It doesn't have as big of a harassment as I thought it would, but it's really good at dealing damage with the spear. The spear has like actually weirdly really strong damage scaling, but it's a little bit difficult in terms of getting out and getting in. You lower your stam significantly when you go into light, so you're not able to exist a little bit worse. It seems like it could be good in terms of pressuring people that are not warded to thrust, but that being said, a lot of kill squad people are warded to thrust, so I'd say it's generally not good unless you're going someone that's running a lot of physical aversion, in which case this gets right through that, and they won't be expecting the spear, and that's where it kind of shines, which is why it's a situational oriented damage build in a war setup. Lightbow Hatchet, solid, but the main problem is Hatchet is just a lot less good than it once was. It's no longer a 3-second cheese that you can get out and do whatever the heck you want. So it kind of has fallen off significantly. The bow tree, I don't believe, has changed a ton, but the it did get nerfed a little bit, but with the armor nerfs as well, it feels more like a buff to bow in terms of damage overall. So I'd say very solid. Most people aren't heavily warding the thrust right now too, which makes bow interesting, but I still think it's better with rapier than hatchet. And then lastly, for the situational builds, light, great axe, great sword. This one has really good stam. It's just if people look at you, you will just die. But if people don't look at you, this is like a very, very easy way to take over a lobby. So there are certain players that everyone knows that run this build and literally just take over OPRs. They take over wars when they're not in check. But if you just check those players, they basically get no value. And it's like might as well not be in the war. So as long as you are aware of these builds and you take the appropriate actions, they won't do anything, but they are very good. It's a very good pug stomping build, if that makes sense. Like if you just want to frag out and you versus people that you don't think are as good, this is a really good build to run for that circumstance in order to get high kills and really shove like yourself down their throat. Medium Spear Void Gauntlet, I'd say, is generally something I wouldn't advise in a war, but it's a good OPR oriented build. You just don't have the survivability that you need, especially with the Void Gauntlet's damage changes. It doesn't feel as good. Before it felt a little bit decent because then you kind of had unlimited stam in your Oblivion with the flat Oblivion gen rate with the spear dodges. Like Greatsword Hatchet seems like a build that I would generally not want to run. It's kind of a fun build to watch in OPR still, but you go to Greatsword and try to use that for damage, you mistime it by one attack, and you're basically going to be dead. And Hatchet won't actually help you live that much anymore, so generally not something I would recommend running, but it's not awful. Light Musket Rapier doesn't seem viable anymore. If you go accuracy, the damage is too insignificant, and if you don't go accuracy, your consistency is too insignificant. It doesn't seem like something that will take over the meta or even be viable on defense on the walls, which is where you would really think it would be viable, but that's kind of the state of Musket Rapier at this point. Along with the along with the PvP perk that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but I'll throw in here. The nerfs to that where you gain 2% damage per stack, that is basically killing this class as a whole. Medium Greatsword Hatchet's the last honorable thing on this list. The Greatsword doesn't live very well. The Hatchet doesn't help you. It's that weapon kit across the whole went from like one of the best weapon combos in the game to probably one of the worst weapon combos in the game overnight with the patch. In terms of point-oriented builds, heavy SNS VG is by far the most like must-have build I'd say in the current meta. You just need it to actually live and exist. If you don't have this, you will just find yourself dying a lot. A Great Axe Warhammer, I think in heavy is also kind of a must-have. The medium variant doesn't seem as good on point anymore. Your main point on the heavy on point, especially with Great Axe Warhammer, even in medium, you don't have significant enough damage to burst a clump alone, but you can group people up and then people could follow up on your group up. So you're basically a support class at this point. Might as well accept it and just go heavy. Gain 12% or more, depending on how much Fortify you have, extra survivability, sacrifice your damage by 10%. It feels a little bit clumsier, but it's kind of what you have to do in this current meta. Light Life Staff Rapier with Beacon is like the default point healer build. Seems very solid. I'd say it's meta defining, not like necessarily like super duper like must have. Like you need to have these builds, but it's not just, it won't like kind of carry the lobby. There's like other builds that you could be running in terms of life staff that are just fine. Heavy IGVG. I'd say the medium tends to be a little bit worse on point. The survivability, there's no reason really not to run it. The medium dodges feel a little bit better, yes, but you just want to be able to live the fire staff and detonate onslaught, and heavy is the way to do that. Heavy Void Blade also seems to be like a meta-defining thing. I'd say it's a little bit less common than I would have expected it to be, but it's very solid, especially when you stack that with an SNS on top of an SNS, because an SNS can just kind of play with the Sword and Shield out. You could just play with your Void Gauntlet out, and it tend to duo like very, very well. It seems like a build that the main thing it suffers from is tracking, but on point, people won't really be able to run away from you, and you just apply that old Ren to get really fast CDR, you land consistent screams, throw orbs out, you get ult super, super fast. Very high skill cap build on point, I'd say, but it feels a little bit clumsy at times. Light Life Staff Rapier with designated single target healing, I'd say is a generally good build. It's just helpful, but at the same time, I almost feel like you could run another Beacon player at this point and get a little bit more value. I don't think it's bad though, and I think it's generally good to have one or two of these in an army roster. Double heal groups tend to be popular in point tank groups, and across every region that I've seen, so not a lot of reason not to have one of these in a point group. Medium IGVG is good, but unlike heavy, you have to play more passive. You kind of play the edge of points. And at that point, you're not like really a deady point player. You're more like a normal medium IGVG who is focusing point, I'd say. You can't constantly D-tick it, and that's the main reason why it suffers. Heavy SNS, great. This shouldn't be great sword. Heavy SNS Great Axe, I think, is pretty good. But the main thing it suffers from is just the lack of like utility. You don't really feel complete with this, but the main thing that the benefit that it has is just AoE weakens. You can stack up to like 60 something% weaken, which is way over what you're normally able to with other classes on one build. very good for swinging club fights in your favor and just grouping people up. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a build that people move towards later on, but has not taken off as much in the early war meta as I thought it would have. Light Lifestaff Rapier with AoE heal, I'd say is very situational. If you heavy stack the point, this is a build that can be good, but due to the way that Orb of Protection doesn't really provide any Fortify now, I don't think it's like super viable. It's not super useful as a whole compared to the other healer builds on this list. Heavy SNX, Greatsword, Oh no, I did have those mixed up. Yeah, heavy SNS Greatsword is not that. Sorry, I'm going back to what I'd said before. Generally good SNS Greatsword. I forgot about this, but Greatsword, if you use it as a secondary, can be a very good complement to SNS because you can just get that stand back very, very quickly. I think for a while we thought that SNS Spear would be better. I think Greatsword is basically just better Spear. Spear feels a little bit too awkward to do for the Cyclone. It's just a little bit too long of an animation. Greatsword's a little bit faster at that. You also get the Relentless Rush to get out of clumps. It just feels a little bit better overall. But heavy SNS Great Axe is really good for just pumping debuffs, as I mentioned, and is a pretty good build, but I'd say is generally situational to run on point and is a little bit better as a ball setup than a point setup. Heavy SNS Spear, the main problem it lacks is how Cyclones is a really long animation. Everything else feels pretty good, but it's like kind of a single target debuff rather than AoEs. The main benefit is like the sweep. The sweep can be really, really strong, but if you're using sweep a lot, you're not really having SSS on, and then you at that point, like heavy spear IG might be better. But so that being said, heavy spear IG I'd say is a very situational build to run. The main thing it suffers from is it just doesn't do enough if you don't land the sweep. But the sweep itself can be fight turning. I think it's just generally best to play this on the edge of point, but near point itself, and it can be slotted in a point group. Heavy BBIG, I don't think is something I would try to run anymore. It just doesn't feel as impactful as it once did. It doesn't live as well. It doesn't pump as much damage. It's not bad. It's just not super scary, I'd say, and it's not like a super good shot caller build anymore either, I would say, in my opinion. Heavy BBIG is also something that I would not generally run anymore on point. It seems a little bit better off point to focus point with this build. I think it could be slotted in a point group as just like a, hey, I see my bruiser's making this clump and I want to make sure it dies sort of thing. But other than that, I don't think it's generally super strong. It's not super tanky as it once was. It's just kind of like a cat and mouse sort of game with BBIG or BBVG in general. So let me know what you guys think about this, but this is what I have in terms of tier list. It's a little bit different than what I've done before, but I think this should be a little bit easier to figure out like what you want to slot. That being said, for the ball groups, the really meta move is trying to fit as many kill squad players into ball groups and then running like a 3-man ball with a healer, and then one kill squad player has been kind of the thing that's been happening mostly, or sacrificing another ball group entirely to have another kill squad group. Those are the two things I've seen a lot, but kill squad is meta defining at this point. Point tanks have adapted to survive the kill squad, and ball groups are literally just there to sort of pressure the kill squad. But that being said, if the kill squad actually focuses ball groups, they tend to delete them. So yeah, let me know what you guys think, but this is what I have in terms of what is being played right now, and I'll see you guys in the next video.